I'm Vishakha Desai, Special Advisor to President Lee Bollinger on Global Affairs, and also a professor at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and a proud member of the Committee on Global Thought. On behalf of my colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome all of you. And I should just simply say that I was talking to a number of you, and you said that this seems to be one of the largest gatherings of the 1754 Society. And I immediately thought, aha, it's because you really care about the global issues, which I know you do. I know you do. But it also has to do with the Rainbow Room. And as my lunch partner, Kathleen, just pointed out, the combination of interest and convenience is not a bad combination. So thank you for being here. All of you know well that Columbia University in the city of New York has always been committed to the world that we live in. And that has been a commitment of this university right from its very inception. It is particularly important to President Lee Bollinger that we think about our role in the academy in relation to the world and respond to the changing conditions of the world. That brings us to the question of the new global world that we live in. And I think this is something that Lee Bollinger has been deeply committed to. So when Amelia was talking about Manhattanville, which perhaps will be one of those major, major landmark contributions of President Bollinger to this university, the other area that is his aspiration should be the legacy that he can leave behind in making this university much more part of the world, in the world, and learning from the world. And it is about the global strategy of the university. And he has said this in many, many different occasions, and for the last 10 years or more, has been committed to developing multiple initiatives that go all the way from the establishment of 8 global centers to supporting the students, undergraduate students from the college, to go and travel in the world, to study in the world, to also developing new modes of research. Because as he has established, he often talks about how we need a forum that actually would allow us to create new forms of knowledge, new methods of looking at the critical issues that we face in the world and prepare our students for that world that is, as Dr. Ford pointed out, is much more interdependent than it has ever been in our history or in the history of the world. So the Committee on Global Thought is one of those seminal initiatives of President Bollinger. It is almost a decade old, and it really intends to bring people, scholars, academics from different disciplines to really create these new forms of knowledge. And we are delighted that a number of my colleagues are here. And before I actually talk about this in the program today, I want to turn the microphone over to Professor Carol Gluck. You all have full bios in your booklets, so I am not going to take the time because we have so little time. We're going to go right to the topic at hand. And so let me just simply say that Professor Gluck, a deeply committed globalist with a very, very detailed and deep knowledge of history of Japan. She's a George Sansom Professor of History at Columbia University, a founding member of Committee on Global Thought, and now the chair of the Committee on Global Thought. Without further ado, please welcome Carol Gluck.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here and also for the words that Dr. Ford spoke about our world. I'm not going to take much time, only to say that the Committee on Global Thought, I think I'm echoing, is that better? The Committee on Global Thought was established by the President in order to try to think in different ways about the world we live in, to do research in different ways, to look and search for different categories, to teach differently. And the last important point is that when President Bollinger says global Columbia, he doesn't mean that the globe is the world out there. He means the global world is the world we live in. as Vishakha just said. So those of you who are old Columbia folks will know that it's something similar to what Columbia talked about after World War I, when it said, we have to learn to understand the contemporary world and establish the core course in contemporary civilization. So the global world is here, it's now, it's with us, and it's the world that we live in. Our committee members, we have 32 members, and here today we have several of them, and you have full bios, but I just want to say a couple of words about Professor Mamadou Diouf, who is a professor of African Studies and the director of the African Institute and a historian. Professor Adam Tooze, who writes about economic and political history, Europe and the United States, and is a historian. And Professor Wafaa El-Sadr, who from the School of Public Health has been engaged all over the world in pioneering efforts to control such diseases as HIV/AIDS. She is a university professor. Jeff Niu is a Columbia senior, graduating senior. He is the chair of the Undergraduate Committee on Global Thought and a major in East Asian languages and cultures. And then we have Wei Qing Tan, who is our representative of our inaugural cohort of master's students. We've just begun an MA in Global Thought this year with 18 students, and Wei Qing comes to us from Singapore via Oxford, and so she is representing her MA students. And Dr. Desai, you've just heard about. So I want now to turn immediately and ask each of our panelists. I have to say that in 3 minutes, I don't think they can cover the world from 1754 to 2054. So you'll forgive them if they concentrate on the future rather than the past and talk a bit from their point of view about what they see as the main pressing challenges and questions in the global world over the next 30 years. So I'm going to ask Professor Mamadou Diouf to start.
Okay, Aaron. What I would like to do in 3 minutes is talk about Africa from the actually creation of Colombia to what Africans have been doing these last 5 years, working on what they call the Agenda 2063, thinking about the future, and I underline they want. If we talk about Africa, a huge continent, very diverse, in the 18th century, what we could say, it's a continent populated by people who are not actually imagined not only as human, but people who are outside of history, because the late 18th century is defined by a device, which is race. And based on race, people are actually located in a global map. Jumping more than 1 century, I would like to point that the 1960s are important for Africans because it's independence. And the way they imagine the promise of independence is recovering their culture, introducing themselves in history, and participating in the world order. What it means? It means that for Africans and for blacks, the global scene is the scene they struggled because of their exclusion from world history. So globalization is something which is part of what Africans imagine. Jumping 50 years again, what happened between independence and the 90s is a crisis, political, economic, demographic. People talk about the multiple transition Africa went through, demographic, economic, political, cultural, and health-wise also. And I think that Wafaa will talk about that. And how to deal with that situation is also another moment of globalization. precisely because the IMF and the World Bank, but also Western countries, decided that they were going to fix Africa, this continent which was dysfunctional. But at the same time, the African youth and African women began also reimagining the continent and what the continent should be in order to fix itself outside of the prescription of the West, if you want. And the tension is a tension which is both cultural, political, and economic. And you know, one thing which is very important is a kind of Afro-pessimism which was generated. And the fact you have many books which are published with one question: is Africa going to disappear? Are Africans going to vanish from the face of this earth? And lastly now, because things have changed, because the context have changed, because Africans are more and more present in the international scene, musicians, plastic artists, but also, you know, NBA basketball players, which means that Africa is being imagined and invented outside of the continent. And it's the convergence between Africa and its diaspora which is projecting the continent in the future. And it's what the Agenda 2063 is trying to do. And one thing which is very fascinating is the return, the rededication to what they call Pan-Africanism and the African Renaissance. And Colombia should play a role in that, because these two concepts which are going to guide Africans were invented in our neighborhood. Is it our neighborhood or are we part of it? Is today probably one of the questions we should face to participate in the open discussion, because Harlem was crucial in that. Thank you.
Thank you. Adam?
Thank you. I'm going to run a clock on myself because that 3-minute thing, that's hard to stick with. So I have a great pleasure of being one of the modern historians on the CGT team. And the theme that I think, if I had only 3 minutes to sort of single out as my central preoccupation, is the question of global money and its future. And I think we can be confident that it is going to have a future, and this is going to be a key issue for us, because we already have it, and it's already causing problems. And we've already demonstrated fairly satisfactorily that we don't know how to think about it or to govern it at this point. So the sort of global money that we already have, and it's quite difficult to predict other ones in the future, but the sort of money that we already have that has this odd new sort of property is what you might call global euro dollars. These things originated in the 1960s. It was offshore lending of dollars, deposits, credit, liquidity created in dollars by non-American actors. And this has now expanded to an absolutely extraordinary extent and become one of the really dominant factors in global finance. Dollar-denominated business activity, credit and deposits centered to that extent on the US economy, but outside the US economy by non-US actors. So this poses two absolutely fundamental problems for thinking, and this is why this is, I think, a legitimate object of concern for a body like the CGT, because it challenges two really fundamental preconceptions we have about money, which is that it is national, dollars belong to the United States, and ultimately the money stuff, the green stuff, is created by states. And the extraordinary thing about global money, and certainly the first form that we've seen, is that it has neither of those properties. Neither of those two things is true. It's actually not created in the United States. It's created by European actors, by Asian actors for their own convenience and at their own free will, and it is privately created. It is created by all of the major financial actors, some American, some not American actors outside the United States. And it is at this point beyond the control of government. Now this, on the face of it, might seem to be some kind of paradise. We've found a global commercial network, a global mesh that we can create for ourselves, a common denominator, a common unit of account. But what we have seen, we've seen this repeatedly, in fact, euro dollars have always been a problem. They helped to blow up the Bretton Woods system. They caused an enormous problem in the 1970s. But what we've really seen since 2008 is that when that house of cards, that extraordinary pyramid, which all credit systems are, not just the Ponzi schemes, all credit systems rely on these various asymmetric architectures, when they start to come down, the unit of currency, the unit of account actually matters. And if throughout the world trillions of dollars are built on a dollar-backed system that is in fact only one agency in the world which can provide the safety net and the backstop, and that happens, not surprisingly, to be an American institution, and its most important branch is in New York, its headquarters is in Washington, and I'm of course talking about the Federal Reserve System. And thinking about the consequence of this conceptually, politically, and institutionally is a matter of really, it's very hard to exaggerate how urgent this problem is. And the consequences of not understanding this and the way in which, as it were, conventional thought seeps in and structures this whole problem, and I'll summarize this in 30 seconds to stay within the 3-minute line, if we continuously think globalization in the wrong way. The huge stories of the 90s and the 2000s was China. China, China, China. And that's for obvious reasons. But China tempts us into old habits of thinking because the Chinese economy is a state-run, state-controlled national economy, which is where the crisis, in fact, didn't happen. The place where the crisis happened was in this new world of transatlantic finance, a new old world of transatlantic finance, which required transnational governance, which was simply not there or had to be improvised. At the time, there was every reason to put a veil of secrecy over the operations that the Fed performed. But 10 years on, it seems to me, 8, 9 years on at least, it's crucial that we start thinking openly and concertedly about them. And having spoken to President Bollinger about this already, and not, however, having the chance to speak to Carol about it, one of my ambitions for CGT is to make it one of the central locations where critical scholars, academics, practitioners, and technicians of this global money can actually converge to think through the profound conceptual issues that and political issues that it raises.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Perfect. All right, go ahead, Wafaa.
Yes. Good afternoon, and thank
Speak
you very.
up.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here today. So I'm going to try very briefly to summarize where I see global health going. Where's the future? 50 years from today. And I want to leave you maybe with three phrases, and I'll talk a little bit about each of them. The first one is the schism, the no-do schism that exists in the world today. And the second is that there are no magic bullets when it comes to global health. And the third phrase is the revolution in communication around the world. So let's start with the no-do divide, as I call it. I think it's been realized over the past few years, maybe five years or so, that there's a huge schism that exists between what we know versus what we do. And this means that a lot of the discoveries that have been discovered by people at Columbia University and elsewhere around the world in many, many different disciplines, that many of these discoveries that have been shown to work remain where they are. They have not been implemented, they have not been scaled up, so they've never had an impact on the lives of people around the world. There's a huge no-do divide. Some people call it the responsibility gap, the divide between thinking, discovery, and action. So that's the first thought. The second thing that I want to talk to you about very briefly is of course, the whole issue of there's no magic bullets. So naively, maybe we always used to say that there will be one thing that will make a huge difference. If only we had an HIV vaccine, that would be it. We'd be able to control the epidemic. If only we had one treatment, this would work. And I think what we've realized that this was really naive, and there really is no magic bullet. If we had an HIV vaccine today, we'd have to learn an awful lot of things before we could demonstrate the impact of this vaccine. We'd have to, first of all, talk to people about whether they believe they're at risk for HIV or not, because otherwise they won't take the vaccine. We'd have to convince them that the vaccine is not going to give them HIV, is going to protect them against HIV. We're going to find ways to distribute the vaccine. We're going to find ways to give the vaccine, to measure the impact, and so on and so forth. So it means that we need to work together. There's no magic bullet. One needs to wrap around any new discovery a multiplicity of disciplines and expertise, from social sciences to implementation science and many others, in order to demonstrate an impact as we move forward with these discoveries. And lastly, I think we're going to have to deal with the remarkable revolution in communication that's going on around us and globally. I was just in Ethiopia as of last Sunday, and I was staying in a hotel, and I looked outside the hotel, and right across the street from the hotel was an informal settlement, shacks, essentially. But on top of every shack was a satellite dish. On top of every shack, there's no running water, there are no latrines, but there's a satellite dish on top of every shack. And think about that. It means that the people in the families in those shacks are watching what we are watching here on television. They're connected to all of us. They're hearing the same thing. They're trying to digest the same thing and try to incorporate the same messages into their lives. And then I went out and visited a clinic, and there was a long row of mothers carrying their babies, and they're waiting for their services. And one of them sort of fishes deep into her bosom and pulls out a cell phone. And I realized again is that there's a huge potential. The potential that exists through now our interconnectivity, our interconnectiveness, whether it be through the satellite dish and reaching people around the world, or whether it be through mobile technology in terms of how we will influence the health of next generation. So those are the three thoughts that I want to leave you with. But most importantly, I think, what does it mean for Columbia? And I think what it means is that we are experiencing and will experience a transformation in academic institutions, from largely being focused on research and education to also being quite interested and committed to action. To how do you make that? How do you take those discoveries and take them to action? How do you demonstrate how to implement, how to scale them up? How do we get them to the people who need them? And that's a huge horizon that I feel is very, very exciting for our university, and I think can bode extremely well for the future of the health of populations around the world. Thank you.
Jeff?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff. I'm the co-chair of the Undergraduate Committee on Global Thought, and I'm also a senior at Columbia. And I think what I'm going to focus on is the Columbia experience and the undergraduate perspective of that experience. But before I touch on that, I've been working in education for the last 3.5 years in the education industry, specifically in China. And just reading a lot and just observing, I realized that even though in the last 30 years there's been an enormous change in communications, in technology, and the way we do business, the fundamental approach to education has not really changed. It's been relatively static. And I think students now, they understand the importance of a global outlook, and they recognize that it's important and it has many consequences, yet many of them aren't influenced by those type of exchanges. So I think we're lacking behind in that respect. However, Columbia is doing a very good job to address that. We consider ourselves a global university, and we consider ourselves a university that does very well in providing more global resources and opportunities for students. And I think myself, I'm a product of that expansion. I'm a student in the dual BA with Sciences Po, so it's a double degree program. And I think some of my most formative experiences were the experiences I had when I was abroad. And it continues to influence the way I look at things, influences the way I do things, and the way I approach life and work. And I think that's an experience that's shared by many other people at Columbia, the ones who have gone abroad and done things abroad. So I think Columbia's done a great job of cultivating global thinkers and of creating a global environment, although I do think we can do more. I think we are staying ahead of the curve now, but there can be a lot more done to make that even better. As some of you might know, we actually have global centers. We have 8 global centers, and some students at school don't even know that they exist. But the ones who do know that they exist see them as only as venues for special events and for one-time occasions. I think that shouldn't be the case. I think in due time, the global centers should actually be seen by the undergraduate community as an extension of the campus. An extension of the campus that feel like students say, oh, we can go there and we can tap into this reservoir of resources that wouldn't be accessible in New York City, but there are powerful resources that can help us create greater exchange and dialogue of a very intellectual level. And so Columbia's done these through various programs. So we've expanded the number of Columbia Experience Overseas through the Lionshare career site, and these are basically internship programs. And we also have study abroad programs through the Office of Global Programs, OGP. Now, this is all good, but I think it's not just about increasing the number of programs, but actually the engagement through the programs and the depth of those programs and the assistance that things like the global centers can provide to students. And hopefully, by 2054, we'll have a much more robust ecosystem of global scholars associated with Columbia, so students who are not yet in college see Columbia as the institution that they would go to and flock to for the highest engagements of global thought and global affairs. I think that's something that's actually achievable. I'm very excited for that.
Hi, I'm Wei Qing, and I'm part of the inaugural class of the new Masters in Global Thought program. And I just really quickly want to talk to you about mass migration. So migration is something that is very close to my heart because I grew up in Singapore, I moved to Oxford to do my undergraduate studies, and I'm here now in New York to do my master's program. So I identify very much as a migrant. Migration is one of the biggest global trends that has been on the news these days. We've all heard about the huge migration crisis going on in Europe with 750,000 refugees, not to mention the 3 million refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. And nearer home, we have a crisis in Central America with hundreds of thousands are fleeing violence in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. But to me, migration is not just about these dramatic crises, but it's about an ongoing and growing global process of mass movements of people across borders in search of better lives or better jobs or better education. The other major phenomenon in migration that's going to be a huge trend in the next 30 years is climate change migrants, so people who are fleeing severe economic degradation, which results in huge floods that is going to deprive some 200 million people of their homes. So as a graduate student and as somebody who is going back to work for the civil service in Singapore, my interests are very much policy-oriented, and I'm interested in how we can improve frameworks of global governance to govern such massive issues like migration. And that's why I chose to come to Columbia to be part of this exciting new program in Global Thought. Global Thought, to me, the Global Thought program is great because it provides us with a diverse range of disciplinary perspectives. I'm taking classes in global governance, culture, economics, the international regime, and all these things add to my intellectual toolkit, which will help me make better sense of the very new and complex issues which we have to deal with. Beyond that, my class of 19 comes from a very diverse background as well, and between us, we represent at least 12 different cultures. China, Spain, Korea, Canada, Israel, Peru, Japan, you name it, we probably have some connection to it. So to me, being part of this program is about building intellectual dexterity, global personal networks, but also about cultivating a spirit of constant inquiry and willingness to engage with the most challenging problems of our day. And I'm very thankful to be part of this class and excited to see what my course mates do with our innovative educational experience, and I hope you all are too. Thank you.
I think you will see that what you've heard from all of my colleagues and our two wonderful students is that really you are witnessing a new way of learning. Most of the time, except for those who went to the college and did the Common Core, often people think that it's all about learning a discipline, majoring in it, and then you go out and you get a job. What we're really trying to do is to look at any given issue from both an interdisciplinary and transnational perspective. And it's because you have no option. This is no longer something that you can say, I'll do it later on. And that's something you should all be very proud that Columbia is really at the forefront of thinking about this. And then, as Wafaa pointed out, what President Bollinger is trying to do also is that it's no longer just about thinking and researching and preparing students. It's also about making a difference in the world, and therefore there is some action that also is necessary. From my perspective as an Asianist, I will not talk as an art historian. I just want to leave you with three thoughts. One is that 1754 is really the beginning of what we in Asia would call the age of imperialism and the rise of Euro-American dominance of the world. What the Chinese would say is the age of humiliation. So when we come today and when China says, we are back again, they literally mean that. China is back center stage, as it was the case in the 18th century when China and India accounted for large percentage of the world's GDP. So 1754, move right along. Two thoughts. 50% of the world will reside in India and China alone. And 50% of the world's GDP and purchase power parity will come from those two countries. What that means is that in this interconnected, interdependent world, there's also a shift of power that we must actually address. At Columbia, the commitment to learning about Asia has always been there. Professor Gluck, who has a George Sansom professor, we've done this for a century. So it's not that we have not. You haven't been there, but George Sansom has been there, right? Right. But the point being is that we have always been international. We have always focused, even more than many other universities, on learning about different parts of the world. What is needed today is not only that specific knowledge, deep knowledge, but build on it to think about the connectivity of that knowledge to other parts of the world, other disciplines, because it's no longer sufficient, necessary, but no longer sufficient to just be that narrow and deep. And that is the project that Committee on Global Thought is really engaged in. And I want to just acknowledge that we have a number of our advisory council members here. So we thank you also for being part of this, because we also recognize that we can't just do it all at the university. We need to have voices, as I was talking with my luncheon partners, that all of you have something to teach us as well. And so that's something we are really constantly thinking about, is the changing world order. Within that context, how do we think about different parts of the world and different disciplines and different questions in new ways? And that is what CGT is all about.
One of the really fascinating things, changes that we're going through is, as I was trying to suggest, a reconceptualization. And there are, and this was what I was referring to in my rather rushed comments, two basic ways of thinking about this problem of global money. And one, I think, remains rooted in the classical paradigm of states and national economies. And it's the theory that Ben Bernanke, himself, of course, a highly distinguished monetary economist, developed in the early 2000s to explain the increasing ineffectiveness of Fed policy, which is the global savings glut hypothesis, which starts from big aggregates, national economies, generalizations about the populations of Asia, the insecurity, the various other types of impulses which drive them to save in huge quantities, and then derives from that the idea that there's a vast, as it were, flow of money from the east to the west, which is changing the conditions of monetary policy in the West. So this is the savings glut thesis. Ben Bernanke's new autobiography will be one place to think about that. Pushing back against that and thematizing this issue of a bank-centered money system that is really about private business rather than the aggregates of a sort of societal level is the characterization of the economy that's being produced by the Bank of International Settlements, the central bankers club. And this is still an emerging type of new conceptualization, which is why I think it's so attractive for a forum like the CGD to think about, which systematically breaks down the monetary economy of the world in terms of the behavior not of nations and not of societies, but of the profit-seeking corporate entities which have this extraordinary prerogative of being able to generate credit, to make credit lines and to write deposits at the same time in the same balance sheet, and on the basis of that can generate this incredible flow of money. Not reducible to the nation, not separate from it, but not reducible through it. And there really the internet is our friend. Again, this is one of the features of modernity that several of the speakers alluded to. There is this wealth, for somebody of your background, immediately accessible wealth of information coming out of the BIS, which I would point you to, where they are beginning to piece together a radically new statistical picture of how this money is generated. And those two visions set side by side, lawyers will tell you this, that conflict, that's what's generating the new knowledge, the argument between these two different perspectives. That's what makes this such a fascinating moment to be thinking about this. I'm not going to venture an answer, but what I will say is the fact that the entire world, the entire policy wonk universe is focused on that one question speaks to the centrality of this institution. That apparently everything appears to hinge on a 0.5 percentage point adjustment in the exchange rate is indicative of this radical interdependence that's been achieved, that should be the central question. It's a question then of personalities and a sort of criminology where we go through the Fed board and we try and figure out who's, woken up on the wrong side of the bed in November, and that'll be really the decisive variable. That this should be the center of our entire preoccupation is an effect of the way in which this crisis had to be managed. And it again points, as some of the most one of the most critical thinkers of financial markets are saying, we now have to deal with a world which is radically reflexive. It's not just integrated, it's constantly mirroring itself, like these amazing crystals that we have here. Everything refracts back on itself. And the Fed is the sort of gigantic chandelier at the center of that reflexive system, which has properties that we don't really fully understand. Right? It's no longer the natural economy that's law-like and gives politics the rule and tells us how societies will develop. It's sort of caught up in a crazy funhouse in which, as it were, that mirroring back and forth of the argument, it's not even whether I think, it's what other people think about what somebody thinks, about what somebody thinks, about what somebody thinks, about whether the interest rate will go up. That will move global markets of trillions of dollars at stake.
Well, that's not very reassuring.
Thank you. That's a tough question. It's always been interesting to think about whether policymakers use evidence to make decisions. I've struggled with that myself. I mean, sometimes we naively think when we're rooted in academia, it's just get the evidence and show the evidence, and lo and behold, people will say, oh yeah, of course, we're going to change policy as of tomorrow. I think it doesn't work that way. I think what we've done, at least in the work we've done at ICAP around the world, is we need to involve the policymakers from day one in any of the endeavors that we're doing, whether it be in a research study or a programmatic area or an innovation, is to get them engaged, not to wait till you get the results, not to wait till you have the answer and say, oh, by the way, here's the answer, doesn't it look wonderful? But to engage them early on as you're conceptualizing, whether it be a research study, an innovation, a program, a dissemination, is get them involved very early on. They become part of it. They see it happening, and they're much more likely actually to then be, they're much more likely to actually be engaged and advocate for change that way. So that's a lesson learned. I think the other is that you have to think very carefully who are the critical decision makers. And again, naively, one would think that it's the Minister of Health and Global Health. But I think what we've learned is that often there are very critical other stakeholders who are just as important decision makers. And that's when you need to bring in the other disciplines, the other decision makers, and really map who are the stakeholders, who are the people who are going to influence the ultimate decision, and engage them very, very early and have them take ownership of the endeavor from day one.
And that's one of the reasons that much of the work that the Committee on Global Thought does, and a lot of our students do, including Jeff, involves what we call practitioners, or the real world, as we sometimes say, from in what we're doing, so that it's not simply academics separate seeking knowledge and this no-do deficit, or the schism you spoke about, trying to cover it by putting the knowing and the doing people together from early on. And our students, our undergraduates, are doing that themselves. Much of their internship actually is in the doing world, whether it's nonprofit, corporate, or government. So I think, and the other thing about this is that very often, to find who the decision makers are, they are very often the kinds of people who will come into it. The Minister of Health is not going to come, but we deal with practitioners of all sorts. They are interested in actually joining the quest, if you like, for a way to bridge that knowledge action gap. So.
And I would just say that I think that is something that's distinctive about the way President Bollinger is thinking about the whole global project, and which is not just about the research, not just about the pedagogical dimension of it, but also the implementation dimension of it, and how to bring that back into the campus in a very substantive way. So I think that's something that's quite different and distinctive about Columbia as we go forward. I often used to say, some of you know me from my other hat that I wore for a long time at the Asia Society, including you. I used to say that knowing about Asia was like a good idea 50 years ago. I'll get to it when I have a chance. Or there'll be scholars like Professor Gluck who are already kind of handling it, so I don't have to do it. Today, it's a necessity. It's a necessity that if we don't do it, we do it at our own peril, as far as I'm concerned. And I do think that Columbia is well positioned because of our deep, deep commitment to the knowledge of specific parts of Asia. Now what we have to do is to say, how does it matter? Why does it matter? And as former Prime Minister of Australia, who was recently at Columbia, Kevin Rudd, said that it is important for us to actually, when we are talking with our colleagues from other parts of the world, especially China, to at least see the world from how they see it, which is this notion of putting yourself into another person's shoes. And I think that kind of an idea, academy can do that nobody else can do, and we must do that. And it's something that I know that we are continuing to do. But I think it is something that we have to recognize in the world, that we've been too used to Euro-American centrality of power for too long. That is not going to be the world in 1754, I'm sorry to say. We will be important, but not to the same extent. And what does that mean? And how do we understand it? But I do think that it requires specificity of knowledge as well as its relationship to other forms, both of knowledge and countries. And that's the new world that we have to add to the scholarship of a place, an idea, a discipline.
And it's not just Asia. We have to also we have to know Africa.
Right.
We have to know, because all of these places that were once distant in the Euro-American dominated world are no longer distant. And so we really have a task, both intellectually, pedagogically, and then in terms of making things happen. It's a very different world today than it was even 50 years ago. Yes, Wafaa?
Yeah, I just to touch on something that both of you said. I think it's also really important to have today more than ever a sense of humility about what we know versus what is known. And I think that's why I really believe that some of the exposures that our students have, and one of the most important is to go somewhere and then realize all of a sudden that you don't know everything. And there are forces that drive all of us in our education to think we're the best. We have figured out all the answers. And there's something about that, I think not just for the students, but I think for the scholars, is to realize that the knowledge is out there as well, that we have a piece of the knowledge, but we have to also have a lot of humility in terms of being willing to listen, being willing to appreciate, being willing to value the knowledge that others have, whether it be in the traditional way knowledge is described or in the very, very uniquely local knowledge that I think exists around the world.
The Economist had, I think, the Bitcoin blockchain on its cover, either last issue or the one before. And clearly there's something very tempting about this idea that from the bottom up in society, in civil society, could emerge a technology. And Bitcoin apparently at its core, whether or not Bitcoin itself survives, has this sort of public ledger type technology which enables civil society, the wider world, to sort of spontaneously generate order and confidence and stability. And on the basis of that, this would seem to be a kind of radicalized version of this privately generated money. Now, that has real power, and that is the reality that we inhabit. And all over the world in various forms. For instance, in large parts of Africa, cell phone credit functions as a surrogate currency incredibly effectively because people prioritize communication over many other things. So those sorts of systems are spontaneously generated, and money in many parts of the world emerged like that, but we have a long history of the experience with the instability of systems of that type. To me, that fantasy smacks of a kind of libertarian fantasy, particularly powerful in the United States, going back in weird ways to the revolutionary legacy of the 1700s, of a society that will somehow govern itself without politics and without the state. and without some sort of supervising, over-ordering authority. And that makes me suspicious. And that's what makes me think that whatever those technologies are, they will probably have these problems of group action, of collective action, of coordination, of resilience in the face of unexpected shocks that will require some sort of fundamentally authority, some sort of politically legitimated authority. And we are kidding ourselves if we think that those technologies are going to get us past those tough political questions, which we would so like, in many ways, to get away from. They're so odious, they're so difficult, they're so tedious, they keep coming back. And yet, in the end, they may just be inescapable.
Well, I wanted to say thank you, first of all, to our panelists. I know there are many more questions and things that could be said. I think I'd just like to conclude by referring, since it's come up before, to the founding fathers back to the 18th century. John Quincy Adams and several of our founding fathers had a phrase which I find very persuasive, and that is that the most important kind of knowledge in the world is useful knowledge. They talked all the time about useful knowledge, and they really had in mind the kinds of knowledge that does work in the world. And I think you've heard from our panelists that there's a lot of work to do in the world. And part of it has to do with scale. You've heard the word scale more than once, crisis more than once. Our ideas are not adequate to our realities, et cetera. So let's conclude by saying that Columbia and you all and we all and all of our students and generations to come have a great deal of challenge and work ahead of them, and let's all try to make it possible for them to do it as well as they can. And I believe they will be able to do it well if Columbia proceeds on the path that it is currently taking. Thanks to all of you for making that path possible and for coming today. Thank you.